issues, but I think we got them all worked out, so let us know how it goes. Before we get started with the main presentation, we have a few logistics to go through. So audio can be done over your computer or the conference call line, and all the conference call lines will be muted, but you can ask questions either through the WebEx chat feature or there's a Q&A section, either works. And I will be moderating and facilitating the questions as we go. Got to introduce myself. I'm Allison Nemi from the Department of Human Services, typically the person that's facilitating this, so hopefully if you've been on one before, you've heard me. We also have a follow-up evaluation that will just pop up on your screen when you're done with the session, and we do look at those evaluations and collect the responses, so we appreciate if you take a minute to just give us a little bit of feedback on how the session went. I also had a couple of questions about getting the materials beforehand, and I do usually try to get them uploaded beforehand, but they can be a little bit tricky to find, and I do know that. So when you get the information about how to join the conference, there's usually like an email that you'll get, and it says, click here to join. So you can click on that link at any point, and you will find that there's a page that pops up, and when it's time for the event, you can join the event now. But if you go in ahead of time, there is a little section about event material. You can see I circled this button here with red. It says view info. You have to put the password in. I pretty much always make the password housing. That shows up on the invite as well. And then you can upload the material before you start if you like to print out the material and have it beforehand. So I didn't get the material up there until this morning this time, but I do try to get it at least a few days ahead of time normally. So in the future, if you have issues with that, hopefully this information will help. Just a reminder about the format of our forums. So we do every other month, even months, and the third Monday typically. This month is a holiday, so we did it a week earlier. We usually have the presentation taped as long as there's no technical issues. The last couple times there has been, so we don't have the taped sessions, but we always put the materials up on mn.hb101.org, and you have to go to the Partners tab on that website. So if you can't find the materials ahead of time in the way that I described it just a minute ago, you can go after the webinar's over. We usually have them up within a week or so after the webinar. So our agenda for today, we are lucky enough to have Mike Vraw from Hotline come talk to us about repairs and security deposits and renting. And I will let Mike introduce himself and give him a little more background. And then when his presentation is complete, I do have just a couple of quick policy and program updates from the state, and we'll close out. So I believe that Mike is okay with taking questions and would welcome questions throughout the presentation. So again, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will make sure to relay questions to him as necessary or respond to you directly. At this point, I will pass it over to Mike and get started.
Thanks. Oh, and by the way, I have the Q&A feature on my screen as well, so you wouldn't be part of the filter at that point.
Yeah, right. If you do it in the chat, you can send it privately to me. If you do the Q&A, it usually goes to everybody.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to talk for a little bit. If you can't hear me because I'm in a different part of the room, let me know, and we'll move the microphone around. My name is Mike Vraw. I'm an attorney. I work at a place called Hotline, which is a statewide tenant hotline. We advise renters on their rights and responsibilities. We take between 12 to 15,000 calls a year. We're a free service. We have a tenant hotline, which is, sorry, I'm just my first time moving the PowerPoint, so we'll see if I can get it to go here. Oh, there we go. There's the free hotline, 612-728-5767. At our website, we also have an email an attorney service, which is also free. So anybody can email an attorney a question about landlord-tenant law. I do want questions today as they come up instead of one giant half-hour block of questions at the end. I'd prefer it as it's what we're addressing. I always find that it flows a little bit better that way. We give a lot of speeches, Homeline does, to landlords, social workers, tenants all around the state. And if you think that you want to have somebody from Homeline come talk where you are, we've been to, I can't remember how many counties, 35 different counties in the state where we've given speeches in person. But today we're going to talk about actually the two most common reasons that tenants call Homeline's tenant hotline. The first is repairs. Do you have a mouse? Oh, that was the wrong button. Sorry. Apologize. First technical glitch, and it's solved, maybe, sort of. We at Homeline track the reasons for calls. Every time we take a call, we list the reason in our database for the call. We take some other demographic information, where the people are, how many people in the household, things like that. But we also look at the reason why they call. And the number one reason people call us all the time, every year, in virtually any part of the state, is for repairs. The landlord isn't fixing something. So, in fact, 1 out of every 5 calls that we get are for repairs, a little bit over 1 out of 5 calls that we take. And the reason for this is, well, you have to think about the landlord for a second. This is a two-sided relationship, a landlord and a tenant. And the landlord wants to maximize their income, maximize their profit in almost every situation. And there's only a few ways they can do that. They can't lower their mortgage payment, probably. They can't lower their tax payments. They can raise the rent, and we've certainly seen that a lot in the last, I would say, 3 years. But they can also minimize their costs. And one of the prime costs that landlords have is repairs. And landlords do try to, in some situations, and maybe more situations than not, do as little as necessary to solve the problems that they're having with their renters complaining about repair problems. Sometimes it's very short-sighted, and I'll give you a couple examples of those as we go along, a couple specific different repair issues that come up again and again. But in general, that's why we get so many calls about repairs. Landlords are reluctant to do the repairs, and so tenants get upset about that and try to figure out a way to solve it. In fact, it's always been sort of an odd thing to me. I've done this for 20 years now, and I've talked to 33,000 renters in my career, and I'm always still, on some level, just a little bit surprised that somebody called us. Because if you think about it, somebody's got to find a tenant hotline. If they're having a problem with a landlord, they don't inherently know what Homeline is or tenant rights or anything like that. They've got to look us up online or talk to a social worker or a friend or a family member or call the Attorney General's office. At some point, you've got to get so fed up with what's going on that you start digging in to figure out what can I do next. And so this is one of those topics that gets people to call us, is this isn't being fixed. And to start with, we're going to do sort of a broad introduction to the, somehow we skipped a slide there. Wow, hold on, I apologize. There we go. The repair basics. So in Minnesota, like in every other state in the country, there are, in a state law, what we call a covenants of habitability. It's not actually technically termed that in the law, but that's what everybody calls it in our trade. And there's 3 main components to the covenants of habitability. It's up to code. The rental unit is up to code. It's fit for the use intended, and it's in reasonable repair. Now, those 3 things sound very similar, but I'll give you some examples of how it's not necessarily the same category that something might fit into. For example, let's talk about heat for a second, because it's that time of the year when people are cold. It's cold here. I think it's like 10 degrees. I'm not sure how cold it is where you are, but I'm guessing it's at least as cold, if not colder. Many cities in Minnesota have a heat code requirement. there's no state law on heat codes. There isn't. It was actually proposed 6-7 years ago, and legislators, I don't want to name parties, you can probably guess which party, were against it. And they said that, I can remember their argument. It's, don't you think a tenant in International Falls expects it to be colder than a tenant in Marshall or something like that? I couldn't really believe what I was hearing, but then again I could. Anyhow, a lot of cities throughout the state, I think about 80% of the renters in Minnesota are covered with a code for their city, but that leaves 20% that don't have a code at all, a specific maintenance code. But if there is a code in the city that you're in, it's findable. And on our website, we actually have a list of all the heat codes that you can go to and look at, and they're free to glance at that. We are a free service in every way. But when it comes to heat, for example, I was using this as an example. Heat usually requires 68 degrees. 68 degrees in the middle of a room, on a table, 3 feet off the floor, not next to a door or a window. 68 degrees is the number that landlords are supposed to meet in most cities in Minnesota. In some places, it's calendar specific. It'll be like October 1st through May 1st, or something like that. Other places, it doesn't even specify those months. But 68 degrees seems to be the number. The nice thing about that example, the heat, is you can just look it up and see, is the landlord complying? And you put a thermometer in the middle of the room and you'll find out that it's complying or it's not. The next one down is a little, actually I'm going to skip to the bottom. Unreasonable repair will be the next one I'll talk about. When the tenant is shopping for their apartment, they're shown the apartment and they see a dishwasher or a window air conditioner or a washer and dryer. Those types of amenities aren't required in any city code. There's no city code that requires dishwasher or washer or dryer or window air conditioner. 3 very common and commonly sought after amenities. But if one of them breaks, if one of those breaks while the tenant is living there, the landlord might say something like, oh, that dishwasher was put in by the last tenant. I allowed them to put it in, but I'm not about to fix it. It's not my responsibility. They're the ones that installed it, so I'm not going to repair it. The tenant would have a pretty solid argument in this situation to say, well, wait a second, you showed me a place. This is what you promised. If a landlord really wants to, by the way, this is one of the things I'd cover if I was talking to a landlord group, that they would need to disown that washer and dryer or that dishwasher. And there's some leases that make it really user-friendly for a landlord to check a box saying, I'm not paying to fix this non-code required item. If it breaks, it's up to you, tenant, to fix that issue if you care about it. And the middle one, the fit for the use intended, is the third prong of the covenants of habitability, and it's by far the most vague. It's just not especially clear what that means. But again, I'll give you an example of something that wouldn't fit the reasonable repair or the code compliance. Neighbors. So you have noisy neighbors and you can't sleep at night, or smoke is coming under your door constantly so you can't breathe, and your kid has asthma and it's worse and worse every day because of this. There's no code requirement. I mean, smoking is not illegal yet in apartments. It's illegal in the hallway for a tenant to smoke in a public hallway, but it's not illegal for them to smoke in their actual rental unit. So the tenant would argue, well, it's not a code compliance issue, it's not a reasonable repair issue, but right now my place is not fit for the use intended, and so I need to figure out a way to solve that. So how do tenants solve repair problems? We're going to talk about sort of the generic ones first, and then we're going to get into some specific ones, and then the emergency ones at the end of the repair section. The first option for a tenant sometimes, and many times, is to call a city inspector, if there is one. Again, not every city has a code. Not every city with a code has an inspector. But if the city does have a city inspector, what city inspectors do, and they're free, will come to the rental unit, again, depending on which city you're in, and they'll write up a report for the landlord and the tenant, and it gives the landlord generally a deadline where the landlord has to solve certain problems by a certain time, and if they don't, the tenant would have the right to go a little bit further and file a court case called a rent escrow, which we'll cover in the next slide. But there's another way to get there, and that is to write a 14-day letter. So if it is something like a dishwasher or washer and dryer or let's say the landlord promised new carpet for the tenant when they were showing the apartment, but never delivered on that promise. A city inspector is not going to write a landlord up for carpet or for paint. But if the landlord promised it, and especially if there's a promise in writing, the tenant would write a 14-day letter. Landlord, here are the problems. You got 14 days to solve them. After those 2 weeks, or at the end of the inspector's deadline period, the tenant would have the right to file a court case called a rent escrow. So let's talk about that option now. Right. First of all, some tenants will take a more intuitive approach. Instead of a rent escrow, which is basically the tenant being on offense, they'll go with what's called a Fritz Defense. A Fritz Defense is named after a court case from the 70s in Minnesota, where tenants basically went on a rent strike. They didn't have heat in an entire building. I can't remember. I think it was an 8-plex. And the landlord was reluctant to fix it and was trying to fix an ancient furnace on the cheap, and it would rarely work. And the tenants withheld their rent. And it went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And since then, a Fritz Defense is allowed as a defense to an eviction action. So how it works is the tenant just stops paying. Ideally, they'd have some proof that they told the landlord about the problem, and they'd have proof in writing would be ideal. To make a good Fritz Defense case, you'd want those components. You don't need them necessarily. It's not absolutely necessary, but it's going to be harder to prove that the landlord knew about the problem. Now, the giant risk with a Fritz Defense, and the reason why our office never advises Fritz Defenses unless the eviction's already been filed, is because an eviction gets filed. An eviction, a UD, unlawful detainer, they're all the same thing. And a Fritz Defense is a tenant inviting the landlord to file an eviction against them, which means the tenant will have an eviction on their record, which, as we all know, tenants don't want to take that risk if they can avoid that. And so we never advise the Fritz Defense unless the eviction's already been filed, and that's what the tenant meant to do. Now, to make a Fritz Defense actually work, the tenant has to show up in court. The landlord has filed the eviction for non-payment of rent, and the tenant shows up in court with all the money they owe, all the rent money. And then the landlord says, okay, the judge says, okay, I'll hold on to your rent money until the end of the case. And then I'll decide what I'm going to do with the rent money. Maybe you're going to get some of it back, tenant, for a refund for living with substandard conditions. Or maybe I'm going to be giving it to the landlord, depending on how the case goes. But in order to make your arguments about repairs, you need to prove to me not only did you have the money then, but you still have the money. So a tenant calling us up thinking about a Fritz Defense, one of the first things we'll ask them is, do you have the money? And you need to hold on to it if that's what you're thinking about doing. You can't use it to buy food or shoes and say, I had it, but I don't have it now. That won't work for the court. The next one down is the offense version. Fritz was a defense for tenants. Rent escrow is offense for the tenants. And it's much better for a tenant, mostly because they don't get an eviction on their record. To file the case once again, either an expired inspector's report or the 14-day letter where the 14 days have passed is all that's required to file the rent escrow. Now, where this is filed is at district courts in the core counties, Hennepin and Ramsey County. They actually have special housing courts where they do nothing but housing cases. Every other county in the state, evictions are heard at district courts. So you're probably going to be in front of the same judge that hears every other case, you know, criminal cases, expensive civil cases, but these relatively, in the court's eyes in many cases, less significant cases that are just these evictions are heard in the same room that a murder trial might be at that afternoon. So it can be a daunting thing. I've been to courts where there have been my clients facing an eviction, and then people come in with the orange jumpsuits and the manacles around the hands and the ankles, which can be awfully intimidating to a tenant, especially if they're not originally from the United States. It can be very intimidating for them to see that. But if a tenant loses an eviction, all they lose is a civil case. There's not a criminal aspect to it, which is one thing you'd want to assure your clients of. The filing fee for this case is $70. It's set at the same price. The rent escrow is set at the same price as small claims court or conciliation court. The theory is that you shouldn't need an attorney to go talk to a judge or a referee about your repair problems, because that would stop a lot of people from being able to get to court. Our office has attorneys, but what we really do is advise people over the phone. That's how we're built. So we take a high volume of calls, and if we went to court with everybody, instead of taking 14,000 calls a year, we'd take 1,000. Legal aid sometimes goes to court with people, but not always. I think they turn down 2 out of 3 eligible clients with legitimate issues just because they don't have enough staff around the state, depending on where you're at. So tenants might be in court on their own. That's the bad news. The good news is this is designed for people to be in court on their own. And just like in the Fritz Defense, the tenant needs to bring all the rent money when they file the case. We did a study on rent escrows, a 3-year sort of comprehensive study over, 10 counties, I think. And we strongly encourage, based on that study, tenants to file cases when rent is due. It's critical to file it when rent is due because then the court has money in their pocket, and then it's more likely that they'll give the tenant a rent abatement, which is that refund for living with substandard conditions. And in our experience with this study, tenants tended to do much better when they were paying the rent into court. A tenant, if they file a case today, which is the 12th, they probably already paid February's rent. So all they'd have to pay generally would be the $70 filing fee. They wouldn't pay March's rent because it's not due yet. But then the court doesn't have any of that money with them. So if at all possible, we like the case to be filed along with rent being paid. Now, I've mentioned a $70 filing fee a couple times already. That fee gets waived if the client's income is low enough. If they receive food stamps, medical assistance, they're going to qualify automatically. They're allowed to have some income, and it varies from county to county slightly, whether or not they're going to get the fee waived. But if it's ever even close, they should try to get the fee waived and bring along any proof they have of their income to file the case. 2 weeks later, what will happen is there will be a hearing for rent escrow. So let's say the tenant sends the landlord a letter today, the 14-day letter, and then they have the problem isn't solved within the 14 days, then they can go file the case, in theory, on the 26th or the 27th of February. Within 2 weeks of that, they're guaranteed an initial hearing. So within a month of today, roughly, the tenant can talk to a judge or referee about their problem. I know that sounds like it might be slow in a lot of situations, and it is, but in the civil court world, it's actually very fast. Even small claims court, conciliation court, where you can only sue for money or the return of property, tends to take 8 weeks to have a hearing throughout the state. If you're going to pick a most common time, you'll have a hearing. It varies some, but that's about right. Again, what we always stress is that tenants want to do and I apologize, the computer seems to want to go to sleep frequently, and then I have to wake it up, and then it wants to move. So that's why I'm jumping around. I'm not trying to throw you off. Why the rent escrow is better than the Fritz Defense, again, and this is really the basic issue, is that the tenant doesn't get an eviction on their record. So that's always a step we want tenants to take. If you have clients that you're working with that are having repair problems, they can download our form letter. I mentioned that on the slide before. This is the most common form letter and I'm intentionally going backwards on this time. This is the most common form letter that we have downloaded by our clients, is the 14-day letter. Wow, this is a hair trigger, fun exercise. I apologize. Those of you that are dizzy watching me do this, there we go. Hey, it's the last thing on that page is where we have our form letters. There's actually more than just the repair form letter. There's security deposits, there's privacy, problems with neighbors, things like that. They're all listed there, and clients can download them. There's some instructions that come with it. The main instruction is keep a copy of the complaint, because you can't file the court case unless you have a copy of that complaint to begin with.
We don't have any questions yet, but I encourage people to put them in, but I have a question.
Shoot.
So what if the repair issue is something that's like dangerous, like you mentioned heat? You know, what if the heat completely goes out and you really need them to turn the heat back on ASAP? Is there a way to kind of expedite this whole process or get that?
There is, but I'm going to say we'll talk about it in 3 slides.
Okay.
Sorry, we do cover it, but I was going to do it in 3 slides.
Sounds good.
It's a great question because it's a real question, especially in the non-heat season. But let's talk about the 2 less urgent repair issues that we still get a lot of calls about. The first is bed bugs. I can't do a show of hands here. Well, I guess I could, and you could all raise your hands, and I'd sort of guess how many hands went up. But I'm guessing many of you have had clients deal with bed bugs. This is not an inner city problem. I think we've taken bed bug calls from 60 of Minnesota's counties in our office now, the last time I checked. So bed bugs are a strange phenomenon. They didn't exist really in this country 25, 30 years ago. They were gone. Bed bugs were, you'd hear about bed bugs only with that stupid little, you know, don't let the bed bugs bite warning at night. I'm not sure what you were ever supposed to do to stop that, what defense mechanism you were supposed to employ to not let those bed bugs bite, but that was the one thing people would say to you before you went to sleep, I guess. And bed bugs were basically gone in this country in the late 70s, but one of the reasons they were gone is there was a lot of pesticides used throughout the country, one of which was something called DDT, which I'm guessing many of you are too young to remember that, but it turns out DDT caused cancer. So we sort of had this issue of, do we care about bed bugs more or cancer? And we decided that cancer is worse than bed bugs. But bed bugs started storming back eventually. And I see that there's a question. I'll get to it after I cover the bed bug topic, and then I'll take the question in front of me. Bed bugs started coming back in the mid-90s. They started in New York City and several other cities in Ohio. And they have gotten entrenched and they've expanded. If you want to avoid bed bugs, honestly, the best way to avoid bed bugs in your life is to never stay at a hotel. It's just the truth of the matter. If you want to freak yourself out, if you're going somewhere this weekend and you are wondering, really, bed bugs, hotels, you'll type up bed bugs, and then the hotel you're going to go stay at, and you'll see that every hotel pretty much in the country has a history of dealing with bed bugs. I can remember being in New York City a couple of years ago with my wife, and we were in a taxi cab. And in the cab there, they had a TV in the back seat, and on TV they had a commercial. And that's all. It was endless commercials, basically. And the commercial was for a high-end New York City hotel. And I can't remember which one it was, but it was, you know, like this 4-star hotel. They talked about their restaurant. And then they had an image of somebody cleaning the room, and she was walking around the bed with a steam wand. That's what she was doing. And they said in the cleanest rooms in all of the city, and she was steaming the bed. And they didn't say the word bed bug because I'm sure you don't say the word bed bug in an ad. If you're a hotel, there's no way to sell that word. But what they were clearly selling is that bed bugs were taken care of by their steam wand. And so bed bugs are excellent hitchhikers. They eat our blood. That's what they like. They're little vampire bugs. They prefer human blood. They'll go after a dog if there's a dog handy, but they prefer ours. And so it doesn't matter if you have a client that has bed bugs that they're hoarders or that they never clean their kitchen. Bed bugs don't care about that sort of thing. All they care about is whether or not your clients have blood, which is most of them. And if they are able to get into that area, then they will stay. As I mentioned, they're excellent hitchhikers. If you go to a movie tonight, you see the 9 o'clock show, and somebody at the 7 o'clock show had bed bugs, and they came. You might have bed bugs crawl into your purse or your coat or your clothes or your hair. They like long hair. Yeah, you guys can't see the faces in the room, but people are looking terrified in here. And I know, and I can't see anybody here right now, but I've given this kind of speech a few times before. And before I'm done talking about bed bugs, everybody within the sound of my voice will have scratched themselves somewhere. It's just inevitable. And I apologize. It's not a pleasant topic, but it's an important one because our clients run into this. And how they run into it, by the way, is the landlord finds out about the bed bugs, and they treat it. Because landlords really don't want to have bed bugs stick around because it'll get more expensive. The longer they're there, the more expensive it becomes. So landlords will treat the bed bugs, and in the metro area, $700 to $1,200 seems to be the going rate, depending on what the landlord does and how big the rental unit is. For whatever reason, it's less money in greater Minnesota. I'm not sure exactly why, but it seems to be. You cannot get rid of bed bugs with a can of spray that you got at Menards or Home Depot or Lowe's. It doesn't work. You need a licensed exterminator to actually take care of the bed bug problem. And they do it in one of two ways. Either they use chemicals, which again you have to be licensed to obtain, or they literally bake the bed bugs. They seal off the room and they move in a machine the size of a, lazy boy and fire it up, and it just roasts everything in there. I can't remember the number. It's 160 degrees, and it cooks the bed bugs and their eggs. Bed bugs are very hardy. They can last about 6 months without food. So they are a particularly pesky problem. And it's a very hard thing for people to talk about bed bugs. There's a ton of shame involved with bed bugs. People will act like they've done something wrong, like somehow they're dirty or filthy people. And societally, we sort of act like that. I had a client whose mother had died, and she was dealing with bed bugs, and her family convinced her not to go to the funeral because nobody wanted to be near her at the bed, because she was a bed bug person. And it really is. It's just a giant stigma. People will be afraid to admit that they have bed bugs. But what we ideally would want is tenants to tell a landlord if they have bed bugs, if they find them. Many tenants are nervous about doing that because they've heard stories about that $700 or $1,200 bill from the landlord that the landlord has paid. The bed bugs are taken care of, but then the landlord sends the tenant the bill. This really massive bill, and for a lot of your clients, a $1,000 bill or else I'm going to evict you or throw you out is incredibly intimidating. Again, we have a form letter just about bed bugs, and it's presuming that's the story. The landlord has solved the problem, and now they're billing the tenant for the problem, and it's a lot of money. In order for the landlord to make the tenant liable for the bed bug treatment, they'd have to show that the tenant somehow brought the bed bugs in, and here are the standards. It's on the next page for mold, so maybe I will skip ahead because they have the same standard for mold as I do for bed bugs. And it says that in order to make the tenant liable, it's the middle bullet point there, the landlord would have to show that the tenant either brought the bed bugs in willfully, which is on purpose, maliciously, which is on purpose and like laughing like a supervillain, I guess, or irresponsibly. So the irresponsible one is the one where landlords might have a shot. And there's really only a couple cases that I see that landlords ever have an argument that the tenant brought the bed bugs in irresponsibly. The first is the tenant saw a mattress by a dumpster. By itself, I don't think that's enough. But I think if they saw a mattress by the dumpster and there was little tiny blood spots on it and there were things crawling on it that they could sort of see, but they swept it off or they vacuumed it off a little bit and they figured that was good enough. I'm guessing that a judge or a jury would say that's irresponsible conduct of the tenant. The other and more likely scenario is the tenant moved into a place, their last place, and they got bed bugs. And they concluded that the place that they were in was a bed bug place. So they should get out of there because they don't like living with bed bugs. So they leave, not realizing that the bed bugs are just going to come with them. So that does happen. And if a landlord finds out from a past landlord that the tenant had bed bugs and didn't do much of anything to treat the bed bug issue, then I think the landlord's argument for irresponsibly bringing in the bed bugs is a little bit stronger there. And like I said, that's the more common one that we'll see. Tenants aren't allowed to pick the type of treatment. Heat is generally seen as a more effective treatment. You usually don't have to throw away as much stuff. Throwing away stuff usually means the furniture, the couch, the bed. The bed bugs only really want to be where people are. So if it's an unused piece of furniture, then that's probably not as likely to need to be thrown away. Clothes can be solved by washing in super high heat and then drying it on high heat. So having to throw away clothes isn't as much of an issue. There's some laundry costs, but it's not that bad. But the tenant doesn't get to choose heat or the chemical treatment. Some would prefer the heat, most would prefer the heat, but they aren't allowed to demand it. The only thing they can really demand is that the landlord solve the problem. And something we've seen increasingly show up in leases is something like a bed bug addendum or a bed bug clause that the landlord will include in their lease, language that says that the tenant will have to pay for any pests that are discovered. First of all, the lease will guarantee that the place is bed bug free when the tenant moved in, which is perhaps true. Maybe the landlord did some sort of check, but they have the tenant sign the lease and assume that that means that the tenant has agreed or concurred that there are no bed bugs at the time of move-in. By the way, bed bug finding is done most effectively by dogs. And just to ramp up the cuteness a little bit for a second after talking about bed bugs, beagles are the prime bed bug sniffing dogs. They have the best noses for it. In fact, there are some people that have better smell abilities than other mortal humans. Like 5% of people have noses that can just smell more things, and actually it's a marketable skill. If you can really smell everything, you might be able to trade that in for a good line of work if you know where to find that. And people that can, this enhanced sense of smell, say that bed bugs smell like rotten raspberries. That's the closest equivalent they get. Anyhow, a little detour there. The landlord brought in the beagle, and they certified that it was a bed bug free place. Does that mean 6 months later that the tenant should have to pay for the bed bugs? No. The landlord would still have to show that the tenant brought them in willfully, maliciously, or irresponsibly, regardless of what this bed bug addendum says. Landlord-tenant law in Minnesota and most other states is full of areas where it doesn't matter what the lease says. The contract is essentially and effectively, I hate using this word anymore, but it's trumped by the law. The state law will have more impact than the lease if it gets to a court because of one presumption. Landlords always write the lease. Residential tenants where you live, residential tenants never get to write the lease. Sometimes they get to make a tiny change, but usually not even that. The landlord writes the lease, and that's very one-sided, and landlords will put things in like bed bug addendums, but the law doesn't care about a bed bug addendum. Your clients might. They might be convinced that because it says so in the lease, they don't have to, the law doesn't help them, but the law actually would still supersede that contract clause. And we'd be happy to talk to any of your clients that are dealing with the bed bug issue, and we take 600 to 700 calls a year on bed bugs alone.
I have a question.
Sure. On bed bugs?
Yep.
Okay.
Are there any differences if there's multiple units that are adjacent that are affected about how you might approach this or who might be responsible?
As far as who's responsible, it's going to be even harder for the landlord to show that it was one specific tenant if it's multiple units that are affected. If one of those neighbors called me up and said, what's the most effective way to try to solve this problem, I'd probably say, here's the 14-day letter, pass it out to everybody in your area, and have them all turn it in at once. Then, if necessary, all of you go file the rent escrow on the same day, at the same time. And if you show up with 6 people with 6 different apartments saying the landlord's not solving the bed bugs, the judge is going to be it's going to be impossible for them to be impressed with that issue. There is a question that I got from the previous slide. If the lease says washer, dryer, dishwasher, central air is included, is the landlord required to keep them in working order? Yeah, that goes back to that reasonable repair prong that we had. Again, there's not a code issue. I think you have an argument that it's not fit for the use intended, but it's certainly not in reasonable repair if the landlord has promised to include amenity-type services. We'll see things like the pool, for instance. For a lot of people, the indoor pool is the reason they took an apartment, because they know during the winter their 8-year-old will have some place to burn off some steam. And the pool will sit unusable for months and months and sometimes years in places. And the tenant can certainly do a rent escrow for something as unessential in most people's eyes as a swimming pool. All right, do you guys want to talk about bed bugs more in the room? I don't want to jump ahead if you guys really like that. Yeah. Let's talk about mold. That sounds like fun. Yeah, another lovely thing. Why I want to talk about mold is because of the numbers involved. Again, repairs are the #1 reason people call us. And more than 25% of our calls that involve repairs, mold is one of the topics that they're calling about. And usually it's the main topic when they're calling about mold. First of all, mold is only possible with moisture. You don't have moisture coming in somehow, somewhere, or staying in somehow, somewhere, then you're not going to have mold. So the common culprits for mold are there's a leaking roof, there's a leaking window, there's a leaking pipe somewhere in a wall. Landlords will almost always say about mold, the problem is the tenant doesn't use the bathroom fan. That'll be their argument when it comes to mold. And there's a pretty easy counter-argument to that, which is they have motion-activated bathroom fans that the landlord could take away the power to turn it off or on. The minute you walk into the bathroom, it comes on. They're not that expensive. So if a landlord is really convinced that that's what's causing their problem, they could install some motion-activated fans because they'll say that tenants take these 5-hour showers and just leave the water running all the time. I guess that's possible, but I don't think it's as prevalent as landlords seem to think it is. And more than maybe any other repair problem that we deal with on a very regular basis, mold is a short-term line of thought solution approach that landlords take. They want to do it as cheaply as possible. A landlord hears about mold and they start freaking out because they don't know the extent of the damage. They don't know how much it's going to cost. They don't know what they have to do. They have to get in guys with hazmat suits. And so they start to overreact. And one of the ways they overreact is they just try to cover it up. And how they cover it up is with bleach. They'll bleach the affected area to remove the visible mold, and then they'll paint over it with something called Kills or some other product that claims to be a mold-preventing paint, which it doesn't. It only does that if you eliminate the moisture source first. And that's the real cost for landlords, is not getting rid of mold. Mold isn't that hard to get rid of on its face. It's hard to get rid of the source of the moisture, and that's where landlords are reluctant to dig in. But it's a long-term loss for the landlord. If they have a leaking pipe somewhere in the wall or a roof that's leaking, it's not going to cause just that mold damage. It's going to get worse and worse and worse in long term. It's probably going to be a lot more expensive. But it's something that we deal with a lot. Mold is the one area where inspectors are probably not my first choice when it comes to repairs. Many city inspectors will not write the word mold down or any description of mold. They've been told by their superiors that they shouldn't. The reason why is they're not mold experts. They haven't run a mold air quality test. These are expensive mold air quality tests. You're talking several $100s. You can get a kit from Home Depot for $9 where you basically open a box and close it, capturing your air, and send it away. And then they'll report back what they found, but it's not considered good enough for a court anywhere. An actual mold air quality test, you put a machine in, a giant machine, and it sucks air in, and it tells you how much mold there is and what type of mold there is. There's mold everywhere on this planet, and most of it is not harmful to people, but some of it is very harmful to people. So mold is something that comes up a lot, and my first bit of advice always when it comes to mold is a ton of pictures. The tenant doesn't have to say, this is mold, I know what type it is, I'm a mold expert. They can just show a picture to a judge if they need to. And a judge is going to say, that looks, I don't know if it's mold or not, but it looks bad. Whatever it is, it doesn't look healthy. So landlord, you got to solve it. But pictures are the first step that tenants should always take when it comes to mold. And then they can email them to the landlord or text them, whatever they want to do. All right. We got a question about a client living in a trailer park. A water pipe burst under the trailer. The tenant pays lot rent. There seems like no emergency programs available. Any actions help they can use? All right, so the question, honestly, what I'd want you to have happen here is have your client contact our office. We have 2 attorneys, I'm not one of them, that have sort of specialized slightly. This isn't a lot of our calls, manufactured homes, but it's some of them. There's actually more manufactured home tenants in Minnesota than those that live in subsidized housing. So, but the tenancy is usually what we have here, this description. The tenant owns the manufacturer to their mobile home, but they pay lot rent, which is usually $300 or $400, depending on where they're at. They get access to the water hookup and the power hookup as well. So there are actions the tenant can take, probably, depending on where the pipe broke and whether it's the park's responsibility to solve it or the tenant's responsibility. I'm not sure, but I'd have them contact our office and somebody can talk to them directly to try to pin it down. And somebody recommends that they always have their client take as many pictures as possible when doing a check-in. Yeah, I'm going to talk about deposits in a little bit. That'll be my second topic, and that's where I think deposits come up the most. Well, moving ahead, we had our question earlier about what do you do if there's no heat in the winter, which is a pretty good question. First of all, the law that we're talking about has a specific name. We all in the trade call it an ETRA, Emergency Tenant Remedies Action for short. There is a list of things that count for an ETRA, and you see the list in front of you. Heat, running water, hot water, electricity, toilet, or other essential service. Now that's a tricky one. What's an other essential service? We had a client, actually several clients that were disabled living in a high-rise building with an elevator. And the elevator broke. The freight elevator was also broke, so there was no active elevator anymore working. And the landlord was really cavalier about it. We'll fix it probably in a couple months. We got to get some parts, and they're sort of hard to find, but it's not really a priority for us. And we argued that this was ECRA worthy, that we had clients that if they needed to leave the building to go to the doctor or whatever, they couldn't get out, and we actually filed an ECRA over this. It settled, so we don't know if it would have gotten there. You'll notice something like a stove or a fridge isn't there. I think a refrigerator starts to get closer to the other essential service if you have clients that have medication that needs to be refrigerated. I think that would probably up it into the other essential service, but it is not listed officially, a fridge or cooking area for the ECRA. Again, you can do a rent escrow for any of those things, the 2-week process to have the landlord fix it and then go file the court case. But in an ECRA, how it works logistically, the tenant calls the landlord up and can leave a message even. They don't even have to reach the landlord and say, I have no heat, or the water doesn't work, or there's no hot water. When it comes to heat, there's one standard starting piece of advice we give every tenant, and that is you have to get a thermometer. You have to figure out how cold it is. It is not good enough to walk into court and say it's cold. It's not good enough to say I see my breath. You have to get a thermometer and take pictures of it and put it in each room and get readings with no space heater running, no oven running to see exactly how cold it is. Because a judge will look at the thermometer. They won't look at much of anything else. This wasn't my case, but a legal aid attorney that I heard talk about ECRAs once had a client that she was working with that was complaining about no heat. So the lawyer threatened an ECRA. Landlord didn't respond, so the lawyer went to go pick up her client at her home so they could go file the case at court, walked into the woman's home, and she had to take her coat off. It was warm. The client was elderly, and it was about 74 degrees. She wanted it warmer. So the thermometer is everything when it comes to a heat issue, and it's always a starting point. After the 24 hours, if the tenant's given the notice, then the tenant has the right to go file this ECRA. ECRAs are more complicated than rent escrows. It is $300 to file it versus the $70 for the rent escrow. Once again, the fee gets waived if the client's income is low enough, the IFP fee waiver. But once they file the case, it will be heard, depending on where you're at, maybe the next day, maybe 3 days from then. It'll be heard pretty quickly. The judge has the power to order the landlord to put tenants up in hotels, which happens frequently. I'm getting a couple notes that we don't have any sound. Are we seeing that?
Yeah, but nothing's changed. Yeah, let's just take a minute to check in. A couple people are having issues with the volume on the phone. Is anyone still hearing it fine?
Can you make your phone play music so it'll just be a steady stream of sound for a little bit? And we're getting a lot of...
People are saying it's working okay. So I would suggest either trying on you can do through the computer or through the phone. Some people had to refresh. So...
refresh work for some people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, this kind of thing happens, yeah. At the actual hearing, if there is a hearing, the tenant can try to get an attorney. Maybe legal aid can represent them. Again, if there's no heat, calling the city might be another great option. They can put a lot of pressure on a landlord. Cities do not want to hear about tenants using their space heater or their oven to heat their apartment or their rental unit. There are every winter stories somewhere in the state where somebody dies in a fire using an oven to heat their apartment because it's not what they're designed to do. And so fires happen frequently for that reason. So city inspector or this 24-hour notice or both can be approaches that a tenant could take if it's an actual emergency issue. You don't see a lot of ECRAs filed. It's more the threat of them than anything else that seems to work, which is good because we don't want the tenants to have to go to court and file them, and landlords don't want to deal with them at the court. They'd rather solve the problem on their own somehow if they can. Next topic we're going to cover very briefly.
There was one other question on here that not sure if you got to, but can a landlord still shut off heat in the winter in Minnesota if the heat is not paid for? I'm guessing this would be in the case of if the tenant is responsible for paying for the heat.
If the tenant's responsible for paying for the heat, the landlord doesn't turn it off. The utility company does. However, most the utility company will usually not turn the heat off until April 15th if the tenant calls up the utility company and works out even a minimal payment plan. They don't like to do it, but on April 16th, they will drive all around the state and shut everybody down. They do that frequently, and energy assistance might be available to those tenants as well. You don't have to be a homeowner to qualify for energy assistance, depending on where you're, everywhere in the state, yeah.
Right.
Another question I see, if the tenant has heat but it's unevenly distributed, not making it into a back bedroom, what would you recommend? It's probably not an ETRA is my best guess in that situation, but it's certainly a rent escrowable situation where the tenant could file a rent escrow saying the heat doesn't work. I mean, we get complaints in January about people saying it's too hot, right? I live on the top floor of a, 6-story building, and the heat is rising, and so it's 80 degrees in here. There's no law that says it has to be a low enough level. All right, so the last part about repairs is the most extreme version of repair problems, which is where we have a constructive eviction. So constructive evictions, again, I can't see you guys, but the question I like to ask usually here is if anybody's ever used WebMD. I mean, if you go on WebMD, you type in sore left shoulder for 2 weeks, in under a minute, you're going to be convinced that you've got leukemia or some form of terrible disease, undoubtedly. I actually have used WebMD, which is sad because my wife is a doctor. And so I'll type something in and it'll give me a result, and I'll ask her, and she'll be like, that's not what you have. You need to stop going there. So constructive eviction is our most equivalent version of WebMD type issues. What do I mean by that? Well, tenants will try to solve problems on their own now. Tenants are resourceful, and they'll try to solve problems on their own. And this is a phrase they'll find online when they're dealing with repair problems and they want to leave. They want to just get out of their lease. And they'll say, oh, I'm constructively evicted. So, and it's true. It's something on the books in Minnesota. It's not actually called a constructive eviction. They don't actually title it anything. I think they just call it uninhabitable building. But constructive evictions are rare. Again, I've worked with 30+ thousand tenants before, and I probably told 10 of them that I thought they had a constructive eviction shot. And those cases were where the place had burned to the ground, or big storms had come through and the roof had been ripped off and you could actually see stars at night even though there was no skylight. Those are strong constructive eviction cases. And how I always think about constructive evictions is on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have a perfect rental unit in every way. And on the other end, you have a place burned to the ground. And you've got to get pretty close to burned to the ground to have a judge say later on, yeah, you had a right to go, tenant. Because how it works, logistically, again, the tenant just leaves. They vacate, they turn in their keys, they give up a note saying, I'm giving up possession. They get all their stuff out of there, and they go. So a couple of factors the judge will look at in a constructive eviction defense when the landlord is suing the tenant later for rent because it sat empty for a couple months is they'll ask the tenant, okay, describe the problem to me. Well, there was smoke coming in, my kid had asthma, and it was really bad, and I had to go. Okay, that sounds pretty bad, and we can understand it. How long were you putting up with the problem? This will be the judge asking another question. How long were you putting up with this unlivable problem? And if the tenant says, oh, I was there for 3 months putting up with it, I just couldn't find any place to go, the judge is going to say that's not a constructive eviction. I'll give you an example of a constructive eviction. You come home from work today, and you're a renter, and there's a gas leak. And you walk in the door, and you can smell gas. You run out the door, and you call from a distant place because you're not supposed to even make a phone call from that area. And you call your landlord, and you say, hey, there's a gas leak. And the landlord says, what, natural gas, you mean? Oh, it's natural. It's organic. You're fine. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to solve it. You're never going to go back into that place, right? Because you're going to die if you go back there. That's acting like it's a constructive eviction. I know how extreme that example sounds, but I'm trying to illustrate that you have to act like it's unlivable. Sometimes people call me up and say, I don't sleep there anymore at night. I haven't slept there in 2 weeks because of the problem. They are acting like it's unlivable, but I'd want them to give up possession. It's a risky play, though. The only time I ever really talk about a constructive eviction is if a tenant is going to go no matter what I say. And then I'll cover the options and how much I think their chance of success might be if it goes to court. The landlord will, of course, try to re-rent, and if they do, the tenant can't be held for double rent, but if the place sits empty for a month or two or 10 months, the landlord could send them a bill for all that rent for that amount of time. And this is the defense, but it's not a sure thing. All right, I'm about to go into my second and last topic. Are there any last questions on repairs that people wanted to ask before I moved on?
We had a question about recommendations when the mold is due to water in the basement, due to infiltration in the basement. I don't know if there's any differences with that or... Yeah,
I don't really think it's a different question. It's maybe more of a cost for the landlord, but they still need to make the place livable, is the short answer. I don't think it matters whether it's the basement or the kid's bedroom or the kitchen. Any place there's mold, I think you'd argue that it has to be dealt with. I know it happens more commonly in the basement, right. Of course, yeah. Any others? Repair questions before we're into security deposits? Good questions so far. I appreciate them coming in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go on to deposits. So, as I mentioned, the security deposit issue is the #2 reason why people call us after repairs. #3 would be evictions. I understand you guys had an eviction session not too long ago, so we're not talking about evictions today. But security deposits, first of all, they're real money. In the metro area especially, a lot of landlords charge a full month's rent or more. If the tenant has bad credit or they have an eviction on their record, the only way the landlord will say yes to them is if they have a bigger insurance policy. And the insurance policy they want is a bigger security deposit. So 1.5 or 2 times or 2.5 we're starting to see now times the deposit is not that uncommon for a landlord to ask for. Is that legal? In about half the states, it's not. In Minnesota, there's no law against it. So a landlord can ask for as much deposit as they want. There's no cap on deposits. I've had clients with bad credit, by the way, who have been asked to prepay their entire lease. 6 months or a year or something like that. You know what, your credit's so bad, the only way I'm going to let you move in is if you pay up the entire amount of rent for the whole year up front. I don't necessarily recommend that. I know why people do it because they need that housing, but it's what we've seen, not increasingly. The giant deposits are the approach that landlords seem to like to take, and they're also aware that sometimes agencies will pay it, so they ask for it. Now, deposits are sort of hard for people to get their minds around some of the time, but the deposit is the tenant's money, and they're supposed to get it back when they move out. And tenants don't always think that way because the money's not in their pocket anymore. They should think it's their money, and they should think they're entitled to get it back, but they don't always think that way. Just it's human nature. It's not something they have on them anymore, so they don't think of it as being theirs. But we do take a lot of calls. This is, 12% of our calls, so well over 1,000 calls every year about security deposits through the state. Now, we're going to do a couple basics, and then we'll talk about some tips on security deposits. First, when the tenant moves out, the landlord has 3 weeks to figure out what to do with the deposit. Now, the 3-week clock starts only when 2 things happen, and both have to happen. The tenancy is terminated. Now, if it's the end of the lease, somebody gave notice and it was the right amount of notice, there's no question about that. Sometimes it's a little trickier if the tenant is left in the middle of their contract to figure out when the tenancy terminated. One sure sign the tenancy terminated is that somebody else has moved in to that rental unit. That would be the one sure way that the tenant would know. The other thing is the tenant has to give the landlord a forwarding address. They have to say, here's where to send it, and it has to be a mailing address. Yeah, it probably does have to be a mailing address, because the only way the landlord can really satisfy the statute is to send something via first-class, regular, 50-cent mail now. And within that 3 weeks, the landlord is supposed to send the full deposit plus interest. Interest is 1% simple interest right now, which means if you have a $500 deposit, you're there a year, it's $5. If you're there 2 years, it's $10. There's no compounding, so there's no math issues for people. Otherwise, it'll get messy quickly. So the landlord either has to send the full deposit plus interest or a letter saying what happened to the deposit, or a combination. Your $500 deposit, I'm keeping $300. Here's the other $200 plus interest, and here's why I'm keeping your deposit. They have to explain the reasons. There's a massive penalty in Minnesota if the landlord misses this 21-day deadline. And this is most commonly done by what I refer to as amateur landlords. Amateur landlord is not meant to be an insult. To me, in my mind, an amateur landlord is somebody who doesn't landlord professionally. It's not their only line of work. If they do other things, then I think of them as an amateur, an accidental. That's another phrase people like to use, but it's not their only source of income. People that are landlords and this is their only source of income, they don't miss the 21-day deadline because the penalty is so severe. Here's the penalty. The deposit, our example deposit is $1,000. The tenant's there for a year, $10. That number gets doubled, plus another $500 the tenant can sue for if the landlord simply misses the 21-day deadline. It's a big hammer. And remarkably, landlords still miss this. The big, giant landlord complexes have bells and whistles and alarms go off on the 21st of every month. Send them out today, no matter what. Got to send them out. Landlord doesn't get more time to figure out what some damages are or wait for a utility bill. 3 weeks. It's all they get. Some states it's 2 weeks. Some states it's 30 days. 3 weeks in Minnesota. No matter what the lease says, by the way. There are, I would guess, 5, maybe 7% of leases in the state that have a 30-day deposit return policy. Doesn't matter what that says. The landlord still has to get it back within 21 days. They don't have a choice. And if they don't, the tenant suddenly has a lot more leverage because of missing the double penalty time frame, the 21 days. So why do deposits get fought about? Why do we get so many calls about deposits? Well, wow. I will not miss this part of my, my day. Yeah, the landlord can only deduct money from the deposit for 2 things. There's a debt still owed by the tenant, rent, or maybe a utility. Or there's damages. There's a damage conversation or argument about how much damage was caused by the tenant. And the phrase in the law that you'll find, which is, again, very intentionally vague, but it is vague, is the damage can't be beyond ordinary wear and tear, or else the tenant has to pay for it. So what is beyond ordinary wear and tear? That's a question that we get, I'm sure, on a daily basis in our office and on our hotline, and there's no good definition for it. However, carpet is a place to look for sort of a little guidance here. Carpet is, first of all, the big money item in almost every deposit dispute. That's the one where the money really lies, or flooring, but carpet's the biggest one. And carpet is supposed to last 5, 7, maybe 10 years. And if the tenant is in the place for 10 years and they wreck the carpet, chances are the carpet has 0 value. It is depreciated to 0 value. And one of the ways to explain this to either a tenant or to a landlord is to talk about a car. If you're going home today and you get in a car accident and it's your fault, you were to blame, and you hit somebody, there's 2 different examples. Number one, you hit somebody driving a brand new Mercedes, right? The other example, you hit somebody driving a 89 Ford Tempo that's all rusted out and has 280,000 miles on it. In the first example, assuming Minnesota is not a no-fault state, that you have to pay for it because it was your fault, you'd owe the person a brand new Mercedes. But in the second example, the Ford Tempo, you would not owe them a brand new Mercedes. You'd owe them the $75 for a running car that car was worth. And a lot of times when tenants leave, the carpet is the 89 Tempo. It's not the brand new Mercedes, but landlords will ask for the full, $1,500 to replace all the carpet throughout the place. Because landlords never want to replace the carpet in just one room. They want to make sure it matches throughout. And sometimes it makes more sense if it's seamless. It's all from one room to the next and there's no barriers between the 2 rooms. Then a landlord has a better argument, but they don't like to patch it because it hasn't faded as much. I get their arguments. But another thing that tenants will suspect is that the landlord has to change the carpet or shampoo the carpet between them and the next tenant, so there's no sense in them trying to do any cleaning. Or the landlord has to paint between tenants, so they don't bother to, clean the marks off the wall that the kids were drawing. Not true in either case. There's no law that requires a landlord to paint or change carpet between tenants. So the tenant's going to want to clean the place up. Now, when it comes to a court case, we got this advice earlier about doing pictures on the day the tenant moved in. That's my most important piece of advice when it comes to a security deposit case is, do you have pictures from the day you moved in? Because those pictures could be the reason why you get your deposit back. And again, we're talking in the metro area, average rent is $1,100. A double deposit means you're going to be paying $2,300 for a deposit. How do you want to get that back? Day one, before you move anything in, you walk around and you look at everything and you look for any damage and you take pictures of the damage. Any stains, rips, tears, cigarette burns in the carpet, picture. Take a picture of the inside of the oven, especially if it's not entirely clean, the inside of the fridge, the weird orange rust stain in the bathtub. Take pictures of all those things. And then on the last day the tenant's there, they should take pictures again. This time they're taking overall pictures. This is the last thing they do, by the way, right before the landlord gets the keys. They've done all the cleaning. There's nothing left there. They take the overall picture showing what it looks like. And overall means, 5 to 10 pictures in each room, because you're never sure what the landlord might try to deduct money out of the deposit for. So the ceiling, the screens, the windows, the flooring, you want to make sure you try to capture all of it in several pictures. And those pictures you might not ever need. But I help people go to conciliation court a lot on security deposit cases. And the people that go to court with photos probably win 85, 90% of the time. Without pictures, maybe it's 35, maybe it's 50%, I'm not sure. It's just a tougher case without those before and after photos. So if you're helping clients with move-in, move-outs, one of the most important things you can do for them is day one when they move in, find a camera, find a phone that they can take pictures on, load it onto a hard drive somewhere so it's safe, and have them available if they need them. Maybe they'll never need them, but if they do, they'll have those photos. Okay. So, did you have any questions already queued up?
Let's see. I don't think any about this specific topic. A couple will touch back on.
Okay.
Oh, wait, here's one. Once the tenant takes initial photos, should they email those to the landlord or just keep them?
You could email them to the landlord. There's no requirement that you do that. I'm not sure I see much of an upside to doing that.
Presumably, they know what they're.
Yeah, I'd probably lean against it. Actually, I just want to make sure that the tenant holds on to them. If they're worried about losing them, I guess they could email them to themselves. Would be one way to keep it without needing a hard drive to store it somehow. Because emails last a lot longer than texts. Texts can disappear, but emails last quite a while generally for people, as long as they keep their email account open.
Could I just add a little plug-in here for? This is Heidi Sandberg from DHS. On HB 101, we have the Vault, which is cloud storage. Your client could open up Cloud Storage Vault. It's free, it's easy to sign up for, and could download those pictures onto the Vault and have them saved.
There you go. Can you do a plug for a free thing? Is that a plug? I mean, you're advertising.
It's a plug. I'm advertising.
Yeah.
It's free.
Yeah, it's free advertising. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Anyhow,
and we pay for the site.
Understood.
So.
Understood. That's a good service. Yeah. But I have covered the topics that I wanted to cover, and we still had about 20 minutes left, which is what I was sort of aiming for, because I wanted to open it up to not just these questions, but other questions about topics. Again, I'm a lawyer, and I do landlord-tenant law, and I'd be happy to answer anything else you have or stuff we've covered.
We did have a question about constructive eviction for bed bugs, if there's ever a case where you could do that when you have bed bugs.
Well, I could see it happening. You'd need a couple ingredients to make a bed bug constructive eviction case work. Number one is you'd have to run out the door the minute you discovered it. I had a client once who worked for the Park Service. So she had an outdoor job all the time, every day she was outdoor. And she noticed a bunch of bites on her legs during the summer, and she figured it was from her job. She's out in the weeds and in the woods every day walking around, so she's just getting bit, and for some reason she's having a reaction. The fall rolls around and then the winter, and she's still getting new bites, and she doesn't know why that's happening. And so she finally thinks, wait a second, maybe it's bed bugs. So she peels back her mattress, and there's an impressive colony underneath her mattress. The landlord said, hey, this is your fault. You should have told us before. She actually had a very rational reason why she didn't suspect. I mean, I don't know how often you guys look under your mattress. I don't do it very often. So
I'm going to today.
You're all going to today, right. But anyhow, if she wanted to leave that night with a colony suddenly immediately discovered, I think she might have had a constructive eviction argument right then and there. In general, I wouldn't say it's a great case, because usually bed bugs sort of build up and build up and build up, and people are generally aware of it, and then one day they just, oh, I'm tired of it, I'm going to move out. That's not a great constructive eviction argument. You need sort of some cascading event to really legitimize a constructive eviction defense.
I think in the example the person gave, they were like hospitalized from them. Is that possible?
It is possible. About 5 or 10% of people get no reaction at all to bed bugs. You wouldn't even know you're having them. But the rest of us, what we get are sort of painful scabs. I mean, it's itchy and it burns. The one good bit of news about bed bugs is they don't seem to transmit diseases, except in our country where people end up depressed because they're waking up all night. checking to see if they're getting bit or if their kids are getting bit. But they don't seem to transmit diseases, which is the only good news about it.
Right. Let's see. Let's say, go back to the taking pictures to kind of for the security deposits. How do you prove that the pictures were taken, like when they were taken?
Okay, good question. The key is whoever takes the pictures needs to be in court. So you'd want the tenant to be the one taking the pictures because they're going to show up to go to court. Pictures have been used as evidence in courtrooms for about 150 years in this country. And the standard is this, that you swear under oath, I'm the one who took the picture. And this is the day I took the picture on. Unless the other side has evidence otherwise, generally they're admitted as evidence. I mean, people do tricks like, holding up a newspaper with the date on it, showing that this is the date. As long as newspapers still exist, I guess we can still do that. Showing that that's the date. I mean, that works showing the most recent one. It doesn't work showing the ancient one because I guess you could go get one or hold on to an ancient one if you wanted to. Some people will date the picture on their phone. They'll maybe get it developed and they'll have it time-stamped. But it's probably unnecessary, the steps that people will take there. You just write a note down saying, this is when I took it. And then when you go to court, I wrote the note down and I'm the one who took it.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about renter's insurance? Is this something that, like, you recommend people to get? Do you have any tips on that? Okay.
So renter's insurance, first of all, is very inexpensive as insurance goes. I have had clients that had car insurance and renter's insurance with the same company, and it was actually cheaper than just their car insurance bill alone because they got a multi-policy discount. So it's really inexpensive. And I would encourage every tenant that has anything worth anything to get renter's insurance just because it doesn't cost much. If the place burns down or if the tenant gets robbed, the landlord isn't going to pay for it, any other stuff. That's what renter's insurance is covering, is their property if it gets lost. And tenants might not think they have anything, but if they look around, they see the silverware, the dishes, the clothes that they've accumulated over years, eventually it gets to be a lot of money pretty quickly. And so, yeah, renter's insurance is a good idea. The more common question that we get about renter's insurance is landlords are starting to require it more and more, require the tenant to get renter's insurance in the lease. And is that legal for a landlord to require a tenant to get renter's insurance? And the answer is yes. A landlord can have in their lease, the tenant must get renter's insurance, and the tenant would have to comply with that.
Great.
These are your questions, or they're coming in from everywhere?
Everywhere.
Okay, great.
Can a landlord ask a tenant to leave mid-lease if they had another child while living there and the lease only mentions the first child?
No, the landlord can't do that in the middle of a lease. Well, I guess it would depend on the length of the lease. The rule in this state is the tenant, whether it's through birth, adoption, or even a loose custody arrangement, the landlord has to give the new kid, as long as they're under 18, a 1-year grace period. So the traditional birth example, the landlord could say, hey, you're too many people for this unit, according to our rules or the city policy or whatever. And because of that, we need you to go, but you're going to have to go on your first birthday, on the kid's first birthday. And this is the only time I know of this. The landlord has to give a 6-month notice saying that's the reason for the notice to vacate. It's probably the only form of discrimination, because it's based on family size or family status, that landlords will actually write down. They'll write a note. Hey, you've been a great tenant. You paid your rent on time, but you're too many people now. You're going to have to go end of next month because you had a new kid. And they've actually just written down that they're discriminating. In my time at Hotline, maybe we've seen 50 of those letters, and every time the landlord begs for mercy the minute we show them the statute, having no idea that it existed. Usually, it's a state law. It trumps any city rule that might have occupancy limits. It's an absolute pro-family statute. You get 1 year to figure things out. And so the landlord can't give a notice because of that. It's a good question. Yeah.
If there's a policy that a tenant cannot bring a dumpster or discarded furniture into the building, and they do, and it results in bed bugs, can that be considered to be irresponsible?
A dumpster? Oh, dumpster like, furniture.
Dumpster furniture.
Oh, yeah, like who's going to bring a dumpster into their apartment? Yeah, okay. Oh,
that would probably be irresponsible.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah. I was thinking that one for sure. You bring a dumpster in.
Impressive,
yeah, right.
That's right.
like one of those build a boat in a bottle things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Construct your dumpster
Let's
inside.
talk about how you did it.
Right. Yeah, so bringing something in from the dumpster arguably would be irresponsibly bringing in bed bugs. But again, like I said, I think you need to show more than that.
Okay.
I mean, I think as a landlord, you'd have to show that the tenant irresponsibly knew that there were bed bugs or something crawling out of it at least, and that was the risk that they were taking, not just that they got it. I mean, when I was in college every May, there was a shopping weekend where you'd drive down alleys and people would just pick up furniture for next year. But everybody did. I assume they still do it. Maybe they don't. But bed bugs weren't around then, so.
Yep. Also related to bed bugs, one said that they have an Education for Justice fact sheet that says that Minnesota courts have not yet decided that landlords are responsible for bed bug abatement. Is that information out of date then?
There's certainly been, I haven't seen any cases where landlords win these arguments. The law says what it says. It says willful, malicious, or irresponsibly bringing in any kind of repair problem. And it doesn't exclude bed bugs. So bed bugs are in there, so the landlord's got to show somehow that this is the case. I've heard landlord attorneys talk about the same topic before, and what they've said is, I can remember the guy, he's from Tennessee and had this southern drawl, and he said, you pretty much got to have a video of a tenant walking in with a jar of bed bugs to win against a tenant. So I think that's how landlord lawyers view this. I know that's how tenant attorneys view it. Landlords try to pressure tenants into paying, and a lot of tenants just do because they don't figure it out. They don't call somebody like us or ask. Again, there's that shame issue with bed bugs, more than maybe any other topic we deal with. And so they might not want to let the world know that they're dealing with bed bugs. But no, I've never seen a landlord win that argument in court.
All right, so you have a situation where a tenant pays for a repair bill due to the landlord not responding to the calls. Then the landlord states he would not have called the repair service but would have fixed it himself, so he refuses to pay the tenant back. Should they claim an ETRA then?
No, it's not going to be an ETRA. The tenant's probably out of luck. What they've just described is what's known in many states as repair and deduct. It's not something in Minnesota that you can do as a tenant. You're not allowed to. It's been kicked around at both city and state levels before as a potential legislative change, but as it stands right now, a tenant is not allowed to repair and deduct unless there's something in the lease that allows it, or even if they've got a history of doing it, where the tenant has submitted receipts and the landlord has paid for it. If you've got that kind of history, that starts to help. But unless somebody has something in writing, I'd really be reluctant to say, yes, go ahead and repair it and then deduct it from your rent later on.
If a tenant uses a humidifier 24/7 and that results in condensation and mold, can a landlord direct them that they can't use that anymore? Could it be considered irresponsible in causing the mold?
Yeah, I suppose it could be. I guess if it comes down to it, you'd want to get, I think it's called a hydrometer that measures the moisture in the air. And there's sort of, I hate using this phrase, best practices. I don't know who decides. Best practices would say that there's a certain percentage of water that's supposed to be in the air, especially during the winter in Minnesota. But so if you're not exceeding that, maybe you're okay. It would be something that a court would look at. I think the landlord would have a shot winning that argument if it's 24 hours a day, yeah.
So, okay, so, in terms of the security deposit, if the landlord hasn't had time to complete the repairs that they needed to do, and so they don't know the total amount of repairs to charge to the tenant, can they get an extension on that 21 days?
Nope. They get 21 days to figure it out. If there wasn't a deadline, landlords would always want an extension. So the landlords are not entitled to an extension. They got to make their best faith guess at that point. What they could do is they could say, your deposit was $1,000. The bill already is $1,200. And I'm not going to know the total bill until later.
Right.
And I'm going to let you know eventually how much you owe me. Because they can go above the deposit. There's no law that says that they can't.
Okay.
But unless they're eating up the whole deposit with known costs, they need to figure it out within the 21 days.
Can landlords require the deposit at application?
If the landlord requires a deposit at the application, then there's a different law that comes into play. It's called a pre-lease deposit or deposit to hold. And some landlords do that. I would say maybe, it's probably under 10% anymore. It was really prevalent in the 90s. Back then, applications took a lot longer. The application process is really streamlined for landlords now. It's usually minutes, not days or weeks. So a lot of landlords don't do that anymore. But you'll see this. It's normally not the full deposit. It's like $250 or maybe $500 for a deposit to hold. And if a landlord does that, they have to have a written agreement. And these rarely are done right by landlords for whatever reason. The agreement has to say when the tenant will get that money back if they get turned down for the application. And they'll also get the money back within 7 days. It's sort of magic language. You either have it or you don't. If you don't have it, you haven't complied with the statute. And the tenant, if it's a $500 deposit to hold, can sue for $750. And again, landlords, when they hear about that rule, just say, fine, I'll just give you the deposit back. So it's not a common practice, but it's not illegal if the landlord follows the steps they're supposed to follow in the rules.
Are like pet deposits kind of on the same line as that?
Pet deposits usually aren't paid up front there either. It's usually going to be this pre-lease deposit thing. You'll have an occasional landlord that will say, I want your first month's rent, I want your deposit, and I want your application fee, and you sign the lease before I approve you, which is, I always think, really reckless for landlords. You might as well not have an application process, because I think the tenant has an argument that there's a lease in play on some level. So it might be hard to turn them down.
If you're putting up pictures and you put holes in the wall from the nails, can a landlord deduct covering the holes from your deposit?
Yeah, the law doesn't answer that one specifically. It's going to be a case-by-case thing, and the judge is going to look at the pictures and see how bad the nail holes are. But there's no nail hole exception. There's no spackling minimum or anything like that. It's just not covered, unfortunately. So we got the vague standard of ordinary wear and tear.
So use the command strip things that you can take off.
Yeah, some of it works better than others, those approaches, yeah.
Can a landlord require the security deposit first and last month's rent prior to moving in? Yeah, so a landlord will and does that frequently, especially with our higher risk clients, the ones that are more likely to have an eviction because they don't pay their rent. So first and last month's rent and a deposit is one way landlords will go. First, last, and double deposit would be even worse for the tenant. Interesting thing about the last month's rent, if a landlord asks for that up front, I think they've named the number. What I mean by that is, let's say the tenant stays for 10 years, and in their first year they paid their first and last month's rent, but the rent has gone up repeatedly over that time. So the reason why the landlord did that, instead of taking a bigger deposit, is they didn't want to pay interest on the deposit. That's why they had the first and the last month's rent instead of the first month's rent plus a giant deposit. They didn't want to pay interest on it. But there is a downside for landlords that the tenant has an argument that they've already prepaid their last month's rent. Right.
Sure.
Can a resident bring in a therapy animal into an apartment mid-lease into a pet-free apartment? Really? We're going to do that question with 7 minutes to go? Yeah. The therapy animal. We did actually do a whole session at one point on reasonable accommodation, and we talked about therapy animals and such whatnot too. So I would recommend for that person to go view that, or at least bring up the materials of that. Yeah, look, I don't want to beat somebody up for asking a legitimate question. No, I know, but it is a weighty. Like you said, we did an entire session on it, so. Yeah. That is a 2-hour question. The short answer is probably, if they get the right note from their medical professional, is the short answer. For reasonable accommodation. And that concept of reasonable matters. Peacock. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, the peacock is in the news these days because somebody tried to bring one onto an airplane. I always use an elephant as an example. That if you wanted to get an elephant, is that going to be reasonably accommodated? And I actually have some clients around the state that rent a farm, and part of their duties is to take care of horses. Maybe an elephant is something you could have a reasonable accommodation request for there, but in a normal big city apartment, that's not going to work. Yeah. Can a landlord deduct from your deposit for cleaning the apartment? It does not seem like damages. This is going to be completely case by case. It really is. I mean, I always tell tenants, clean it as good as you can, and then take the pictures on the way out the door. And if you want to take one extra step on the way out, have a friend look around that you know would show up in court if you needed them in small claims court one afternoon. But there's no list of things that a tenant has to do according to the law. It's just return it, except for ordinary wear and tear. That's all it says. So unfortunately, the answer is maybe. Lawyers hate saying I don't know to questions, but that's what I'm saying there. Great. I that looks like, I think I got all the questions. Let me just check one more.
That was a lot of questions coming in. Were they all at once, or did you just store them up till the end of the day?
Kind of all at once.
Okay.
Okay, they're...
So we have 5 minutes left. If you're waiting for that question, you've been waiting for all the other questions to clear out. Feel free to fire away.
Oh, I think we did that one already. How does a tenant find out if they owe money to an old landlord for repairs or back rent, provided that they cannot find this information on their credit report? I mean, I guess...
I'm not sure how they see it. Yeah, I mean, if it doesn't show up on a credit report, I think you're probably good.
Yeah.
In general. Evictions, however, so if there was an eviction for non-payment of rent, that is findable for a tenant online. And I'm going to say this slowly, and I'll say it twice. There's 5 letters here. But if you go to a site called MNCIS, so M-N-C-I-S, Minnesota Court Information System, there's a way to look. You don't need a password or to be a lawyer or anything. You can just see if cases have ever been filed against somebody. In fact, if you have clients, this is one of the best things you can do for them if they're not sure if they have an eviction on their record, is to help them look. Now, it only shows Minnesota, but it does show Minnesota. And so you'll see if there are any court cases, especially evictions, that have been filed. Again, M-N, like Minnesota, C-I-S, MNCIS. And it'll ask you to pick civil or criminal, and this is a civil case. And then it'll ask you to state the party's name. You have to have the spelling right. And really maddeningly, it'll ask you to retype some letters that appear on the screen, and you can never get it right on the first try. And the good news is they get every time a little bit easier to eventually the point they're readable. So don't give up after one time doing it if it doesn't seem to be working. But it's a good way to find out for your clients if they have an eviction on their record.
Okay. Very helpful. I think that's it then. So thank you so much for coming today and providing this information. It was really good information, very clear.
And we had how many participants? 160?
Yeah, we had, I'm not sure how many signed up or actually came, but we had over 100. But I have a couple of other updates to do. I know Mike has to get going. He has a
parking meter right.
to attend to. He doesn't get out of that. So.
And again, one last reminder, yes. 2 things. If you have clients with issues, have them contact us. We're free, and we deal with these calls all the time, through the email or through the phone call. And the last thing is we do give speeches all around the state. They're not always necessarily free. You might have to pay to get us to where we're going, but we don't try to make a fortune on it. We just try to cover our costs. If you work with landlords, tenants, or you have a group of social workers that you want to get together, we do this a lot. So there you go.
I'm trying to put up the
hotline number?
Hotline again. It is very
there it is. There it is.
Jumpy.
You're telling me.
The screen. So,
thank you all.
There it is. Thank you so much. And if y'all want to just hang on for a minute, I just have a couple more program updates, and then we'll wrap up. Oh, there it is. All right, so we have an update from the Department of Human Services about the Home and Community-Based Services Settings Rule implementation. And we want people to know if you're involved in disability services, particularly waiver services, you should be very familiar with this. If you've never heard of it before, don't worry about it, but you could always go for more information on this slide. There's a website that you can read all about it. So between April and September of last year, some waiver service providers were required to submit and complete a provider attestation form and supporting documentation. And DHS received approximately 6,000 of these attestations, and 97.6% of settings reported full compliance, which is excellent news. Thank you for everyone's hard work on the provider side and for DHS for collecting all those. That is great. Again, if you want more information, the website is on this slide, mn.gov/DHS/8CBS. There's also an email for more information. And we are in the process, I think I mentioned this at the last webinar as well, of updating the plan to prevent and end homelessness. And draft plan is currently out for public comment. The public comment period ends tomorrow. So if you haven't yet gone to look at that plan and want to provide comments, I definitely recommend doing that. Again, there's a website here. You can also Google Heading Home Minnesota, and that'll get you to where you need to go. There is a electronic copy of the plan itself. We had a webinar last week, and we're trying to get a recording of that up there. And then there is a survey that you can fill out. And in the survey, it asks for your feedback about the plan. It also offers an opportunity for you or your agency to publicly support the plan and submit a letter and upload a letter in support. And we really welcome that and appreciate that very much. There's also an opportunity to let us know if you want to get involved with our efforts around planning to prevent and end homelessness in the future. So you can kind of get more involved if you'd like. And that'll wrap it up for us. We're done a little bit early. Hopefully that's okay with everyone. Again, please enter the evaluation when you check out of the webinar. It really helps us. We have a Housing Options email mailbox that I try to check on a regular basis and get back to you if you have questions. Check out hb101.org for past presentation and materials. Our next session is in April, and we do not have a topic set yet, but there is a spot on the evaluation to request topics. Some of the things we're thinking about are more information about how to do criminal expungements. We're also looking at doing a session on landlord risk mitigation funds, possibly something on client engagement. If any of those sound interesting, let us know, and we will take suggestions and figure out who we can get set up for April. Thanks again for coming, and have a good afternoon.